Welcome to the Atlantic Council studio at the IMF HQ2. I'm here with Hippolyte Balima, the IMF economist, the co-lead of the Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 of the WBweek that just came out this Tuesday morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you for having me.
So you call it two chapters, right? Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, both of them somehow connected to macroeconomics of conflicts, macroeconomics of recovery. But your research comes in a very particular moment, right? The global public debt is high. In early 2000s, the global debt to GDP ratio was around 30%. Today we are around 100%. So what are the key findings on your research in this changing environment?
Thank you, Bart and the Atlantic Council for hosting this conversation. And indeed, our recent analytical chapters of April-World Economic Outlook focus on defense spending and wars. And we do find that these topics matters because they affect macroeconomic outcomes, including growth, jobs, inflation, and public finance, and therefore individual day-to-day lives. And let me elaborate the key findings. The first one is that wars are economically costly beyond the human tolls that war involves. Output typically in conflict-affected countries fall by about 7 percentage points within 5 years. And this is larger than losses typically associated with financial crises or even severe natural disasters. And losses are not only limited to the conflict-cited economies, they spill over across borders with neighboring countries and trade partners also experiencing non-negligible output losses. And as you mentioned, rising conflict and geopolitical tension are also prompting many governments to spend more on defense. And this creates trade-off, especially in an environment with high debt, but also pressing spending needs in other areas. For instance, in our studies, we find that higher defense spending or defense spending build-up can boost economic activities in the short term, but this comes at the cost of higher inflation, even rising debt, and sometimes cuts to non-defense spending, including social spending. And importantly, defense spending does not pay for itself. It typically raises output one for one without larger output effects compared to other types of public spending, like spending in infrastructure, for instance.
Oh, that's very interesting. I want to get back to 2 points what you just mentioned. First, of the conflict being economically costly, and second point on the trade-off. So there are maybe there are more interesting phrases, but there is one phrase that comes up a lot, and it's about the trade-off butter versus guns. So if you can explain it to me, what do you understand by saying there is a butter versus gun trade-off?
Yeah, in an economic jargon, this typically refers to the trade-off between, say, spending on defense. This is like the old-fashioned way of saying gun on the other end, and spending on socials, which is social protection, education, and health on the other end. And just to give you an example, just like an individual or a household, government also have financing constraints. And to finance new spending, they can raise revenue, they can borrow money, or they can cut on existing spending within the budget envelope. And this gun versus butter trade-off arises in the latter case where there is a spending reprioritization. In those cases, higher defense spending come at the cost of lower social spending. Just like, let's say, an individual that reduces current spending or recurrent spending in order to finance large purchases. So in our analysis, for instance, we do find that looking at defense spending build-up since World War II, this is quite important. About 1/4 of defense spending build-up since World War II involved some kind of spending reprioritization within non-defense spending. And in those cases, social spending typically decreases by about 1 percentage point of GDP, meaning, let's say in plain English, lower spending in education and health to accommodate the higher defense spending.
Wow, that's something, right? So we can expect the governments to spend more on guns, but less on butter. You've mentioned your study, and I went through it, and you've actually studied 215 defense spending booms since the 1946. But also in your report, you flagged that this current buildup is a little bit different. We've talked about debt a little bit, but we've also I want to talk more about the world economy is different. We are more integrated this time, as well as the equipment that the governments are buying are more expensive. They're more capital intensive. So if you could name two things that makes current moment harder to navigate for policymakers, what would they be?
Well, you are right. Today's build-up differ in many ways, including in financing constraints for the government, concentration of production, but also technological intensity. And this has many implications. The first obvious one is that initial conditions matter, like the trade-off that I mentioned of spending more in defense are more acute for countries with high debts, much thinner fiscal buffers, but also very large spending needs in other areas. Another one that you also mentioned is that with more integrated global trade, but also concentration of defense production in a few countries, spillovers are much stronger because, for instance, related to arm-related import, but also much larger demand-related effects related to that build-up. For instance, in our data and analysis, we do find that build-up in higher defense spending typically lead to higher output in advanced economies, and these are the economies that are typically arm producers.
The sellers.
Exactly, with limited spillovers to advanced economies. And last but not least, with the higher capital intensity that you mentioned, one would expect much larger, let's say, long-term productivity gains from innovations. But again, there, history tells us that for those gains to materialize, it's required large scale-up, something that will require, let's say, some kind of huge fiscal adjustment to finance those booms.
Okay, well, I want to end our conversation with something very practical. So imagine that, you're picking up your phone, there is a finance minister calling you, and you get a question. Listen, I need to raise my defense spending, but I want to do it in a smart way. I want to add little long-term damage to my economy and my public finances as possible. How she should approach this spending? What would be your answer? Like, what is the genuine meaning of smart defense spending?
Well, this is a great question that obviously resonates in many policymakers' minds, and this allows me to kind of summarize our conversation so far with 3 key points. The first one is that the duration of the build-up, the defense spending boom, matter for its financing. For instance, if increases in defense spending are persistent, financing should also be structural, meaning for a typical finance minister, relying more on revenue financing rather than debt financing. The second point is that policymakers should be mindful of trade-off. And what do I mean by that? Output effect from higher defense spending are typically modest, and they depend on policy choices. So with those policy choices, it means countries need to integrate those build-up in a credible medium-term fiscal framework in order to preserve sustainability, but also protect social spending, as I mentioned. And importantly there too, fiscal monetary coordination is key in order to preserve and avoid higher inflation. And last but not least, coordination can also amplify the benefits of a build-up. What do I mean by that? Joint procurement and efforts, for instance, to limit the import contents of the build-up, for instance, through within regional blocks, can in some way increase economies of scales, strengthening the domestic output effect, but also limit external imbalances.
So that would be something that probably EU is doing right now with their programs. But yeah, no, thank you so much. So let me just summarize it a little bit. Longer term spending is better than the short term spending in terms of like intensivity. So it's better to have 3% over 20 years than 7% of GDP in 10 years. Is that right?
I would put it in the term of financing. If the spending is long-term, it means that to avoid, leading into a higher debt environment, given the current fiscal constraints, government should make sure that those financings are also financed by more revenue rather than relying on debt.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We always enjoy the conversation. And one more time, congratulations on Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 of the WBweek.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
This is the end of our programming for today. Make sure to check out our daily brief at 8:30 a.m. with my friend Jack. He will be telling more about what you can expect for another day at the spring meetings. Make sure to also download our app when you can find all our programming live. Thank you so much.